Have you ever felt like God was pushing you away from everyone else? Like he was deliberately putting distance between you and the people you care about? It's a strange feeling, isn't it? You might start to wonder if you've done something wrong, or if God is punishing you somehow. But what if I told you that this separation isn't a punishment at all? What if it's actually part of God's plan for your life? You see, God sometimes separates us from others, but not to hurt us. He does it to help us grow, to prepare us for something bigger, or to protect us from harm we can't see coming. This idea of separation isn't new. It's a theme that runs all through the Bible. From the very beginning, God has been in the business of setting people apart for special purposes. Think about it. When God wants to do something big, he often starts by separating someone from their familiar surroundings. It's like he's taking them out of their comfort zone, away from distractions, so he can work on them more directly. This separation can feel lonely or confusing at first, but it's always for a good reason. Now, you might be thinking, that sounds nice, but how do I know if that's what's happening to me? Well, let's dive a little deeper into this idea and look at some examples from the Bible. These stories might help you see your own situation in a new light. Let's start with Abraham. He's a perfect example of how God uses separation to kickstart a bigger plan. God called Abraham, who was called Abram back then, to leave his homeland, his family, and everything he knew. Can you imagine how scary that must have been? God basically said, "Hey, Abram, I want you to pack up and move to a place you've never been, leaving behind everything familiar." Now, why would God do that? He separated Abraham from his old life because he had big plans for him. God promised to make Abraham the father of many nations. But for that to happen, Abraham needed to learn to trust God completely. And sometimes, the best way to learn trust is to be in a situation where God is all you've got. Think about it. When Abraham was surrounded by his family and friends, it was probably easy to rely on them for help and advice. But when God separated him from all that, Abraham had to lean on God in a whole new way. Every step of his journey, every decision he made, required faith in God's promise. And you know what? That separation paid off big time. Abraham's faith grew stronger through all the challenges he faced. He became known as the friend of God and the father of faith for billions of people, all because he was willing to be separated for God's purpose. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but Abraham was special. God had this huge plan for him. What about regular people like me? Well, here's the thing. God has a plan for each of us, even if it doesn't involve becoming the father of nations. Your separation might be for a different purpose, but it's no less important in God's eyes. Maybe God is separating you from certain people or situations to protect you from negative influences. Or perhaps he's creating space in your life so you can focus on developing your relationship with him. It could even be that he's preparing you for a new chapter in your life, one that requires you to grow in ways you never expected. Remember, separation doesn't always mean physical distance. Sometimes God separates us emotionally or spiritually from things that have been holding us back. It might be painful, but it's always purposeful. Think of it like this. When a goldsmith wants to purify gold, they have to separate it from other metals and impurities. They put the gold in a hot furnace, where the heat melts away everything that isn't pure gold. It's an intense process, but it's the only way to get the finest, most valuable gold. In the same way, God sometimes uses separation to refine us. He might be removing things from your life that are holding you back from becoming the person he created you to be. It's not always comfortable, but it's always for your benefit in the long run. Let's look at another powerful example from the Bible, the story of Joseph. Talk about separation. Joseph's story is like a masterclass in how God can use separation to prepare someone for an incredible purpose. Remember Joseph? He was the favorite son of Jacob, the one with the fancy coat. His brothers were so jealous of him that they threw him in a pit and then sold him into slavery. Talk about family drama. Joseph ended up in Egypt, far from his home and everyone he loved. But here's the amazing thing. Even in the midst of this painful separation, God was with Joseph. He blessed everything Joseph did, whether he was managing Potiphar's household or organizing things in prison. Yes, Joseph ended up in prison too, thanks to a false accusation. It seemed like things just kept getting worse for him. But you know what? All of this separation was like a school for Joseph. He was learning skills and developing character that he would need later. In Potiphar's house, he learned how to manage a large household. In prison, he learned how to deal with people from all walks of life and how to handle responsibility under pressure. And all along the way, Joseph was learning to trust God, even when things looked hopeless. He didn't know it, but God was preparing him for something huge. Fast forward a few years, and suddenly Joseph is pulled out of prison to interpret Pharaoh's dreams. Because of the wisdom God gave him, Joseph ends up as the second in command of all Egypt. He saves not only Egypt, but also his own family and many other nations from a terrible famine. Now, here's the kicker. When Joseph finally reunites with his brothers years later, he says something amazing. He tells them, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." See what happened there? All that painful separation from his family, from his home, from his freedom. God used it all to put Joseph in exactly the right place at the right time to save countless lives. So what can we learn from Joseph's story? A few big things. Separation doesn't mean God has abandoned you. He was with Joseph every step of the way, even in the pit, even in prison. Your current situation isn't your final destination. Joseph went from favored son to slave to prisoner to prince of Egypt. God can turn your situation around in ways you can't even imagine. The skills and character you develop during times of separation are preparing you for your future. Joseph's experiences as a slave and prisoner prepared him to rule Egypt. God can use even the painful things in your life for a greater purpose. What looked like a disaster to Joseph was actually God's plan to save many lives. Now, let's talk about another kind of separation that God often uses: solitude. Sometimes God separates us not just from other people, but from the noise and busyness of the world. He draws us into a quiet place where we can hear his voice more clearly. Think about Moses. Before he became the great leader who brought the Israelites out of Egypt, God separated him for 40 years in the wilderness. During that time, Moses went from being a prince of Egypt to a humble shepherd. It probably felt like a major downgrade to Moses, but God was using this time to prepare him for leadership. In the quiet of the wilderness, Moses learned patience. He learned humility. He learned to depend on God. And it was in this separated place that God spoke to Moses from the burning bush and called him to his great mission. Jesus himself often separated himself from the crowds and even from his disciples to spend time alone with God. He would go up on a mountainside by himself to pray. It was in these times of separation that Jesus found strength and clarity for his mission. So if you're feeling separated and alone right now, consider this. Maybe God is inviting you into a wilderness experience of your own. Maybe he's creating space in your life for you to grow closer to him, to hear his voice more clearly, and to prepare for what he has next for you. Now, you might be wondering, okay, but what exactly is God preparing me for? What's the purpose of my separation? Well, the truth is, we don't always know right away. Joseph didn't know why he was in prison. Moses probably wondered why he was stuck in the wilderness for so long. But God knew, and he was working out his plan all along. A new ministry or calling. God might be equipping you with the skills, knowledge, or character you'll need for a future role. A deeper relationship with him. Sometimes God removes distractions so we can focus more fully on our relationship with him. Healing and restoration. God might be using this time to heal wounds from your past or to restore your spirit. Developing spiritual gifts. Your time of separation might be when God helps you discover and develop the unique gifts he's given you. Building resilience and faith. Going through tough times can strengthen your faith and make you more resilient for future challenges. The key is to trust that God has a purpose, even when we can't see it. Remember, his ways are higher than our ways, and his thoughts higher than our thoughts. Just because we don't understand the reason for our separation doesn't mean there isn't one. So how do we make the most of these times of separation? How do we embrace God's process instead of fighting against it? Here are a few ideas. Stay connected to God. Use this time to deepen your prayer life and your study of God's Word. Remember, even when you're separated from others, you're never separated from God. Look for lessons. Ask God what He wants you to learn during this time. Be open to growing and changing. Serve where you are. Joseph served faithfully whether he was in Potiphar's house or in prison. Look for ways to serve God and others, even in your place of separation. Keep a journal. Write down your thoughts, prayers, and any insights God gives you. This can help you see how God is working even when it doesn't feel like it. Be patient. God's timing is often different from ours. Trust that He knows what He's doing and that He'll bring this season of separation to an end when the time is right. Remember, your time of separation is not a punishment, it's preparation. God is working in you and through you, even when you feel alone or set apart. He hasn't forgotten you. In fact, He's paying very close attention to you, shaping you for His purposes. One of the main reasons God separates us is to strengthen our faith. It's easy to trust God when everything is going well, when we're surrounded by friends and family, and life seems to be on track. But what happens when all that is stripped away? That's when our faith is really put to the test. Think about it like this. When you're learning to ride a bike, at first you have training wheels. They keep you steady and make you feel safe. But eventually, those training wheels need to come off if you're going to really learn to ride. It might be scary at first, and you might even fall a few times. But that's how you learn to balance on your own. In the same way, God sometimes removes our training wheels, the people and things we lean on for support, so we can learn to rely fully on Him. It might feel scary or lonely at first, but it's in these times that our faith has the chance to grow stronger than ever before. Let's look at a modern-day example. Imagine a young woman named Sarah who moves to a new city for a job opportunity. She leaves behind her family, her church community, and all her friends. At first, she feels lost and alone. She can't just run to her mom for advice or meet up with her church friends for support. But in this time of separation, Sarah starts to lean on God in a new way. She begins to pray more, to dig deeper into her Bible. She learns to hear God's voice more clearly because there are fewer distractions. Over time, she develops a stronger, more personal faith that isn't dependent on her circumstances or the people around her. This kind of faith-building separation happens in all sorts of ways. Maybe you've lost a job and are struggling financially, or perhaps you're dealing with a health issue that keeps you isolated. These situations can be really tough, but they're also opportunities for your faith to grow in ways it never could when everything was easy. The Bible talks about our faith being like gold that's refined by fire. In 1 Peter 1 verse 7, it says, "These trials will show that your faith is genuine. It is being tested as fire tests and purifies gold, though your faith is far more precious than mere gold." Just like gold needs intense heat to remove impurities, sometimes our faith needs the heat of trials and separation to become pure and strong. It's not a comfortable process, but the result is a faith that can stand up to anything life throws at you. Now, let's look at another powerful example from the Bible of how God uses separation. This time, we're going to talk about David, the shepherd boy who became king. David's story is a roller coaster of separation and reunions, of highs and lows. But one of the most intense periods of separation in his life came after he had already been anointed as the future king, but before he actually took the throne. See, David was anointed by the prophet Samuel when he was just a young shepherd. But he didn't become king right away. Instead, he ended up spending years running for his life, hiding in caves and wilderness areas, separated from his family and from normal society. Why? Because the current king, Saul, was jealous of David and wanted to kill him. Talk about a tough situation. David had this amazing promise from God that he would be king, but his current reality looked nothing like that promise. During this time, David was separated from everything familiar. He couldn't go home to his family. He couldn't serve in the king's court like he used to. He was living in caves with a bunch of other outcasts and misfits. It probably felt like his life was going backwards instead of towards his destiny. But here's the thing. God was using this time of separation to prepare David to be a great king. In the caves and wilderness, David was learning how to lead people, how to make tough decisions, and most importantly, how to depend on God in desperate situations. Some of David's most beautiful psalms were written during this time of separation. Psalm 63, for example, starts with these words, "O God, you are my God. I earnestly search for you. My soul thirsts for you. My whole body longs for you in this parched and weary land where there is no water." Can you hear the depth of emotion in those words? David's separation drove him closer to God. It made him hunger and thirst for God's presence like never before. And you know what? All of this preparation paid off. When David finally became king, he was ready. He had learned patience, he had learned to trust God's timing, and he had learned how to lead people through tough times. David's story shows us that sometimes God's path to our destiny involves a detour through the wilderness. The separation and struggles we face aren't roadblocks to God's plan. They're actually part of the plan, preparing us for what's ahead. Another key reason why God separates us is to prepare us for a bigger role or responsibility. Sometimes, God needs to work on us in private before he can use us in public. This preparation often involves separation from our normal routines and relationships. Think about it like this. When an athlete is training for a big competition, they often separate themselves from normal life. They might move to a special training facility, follow a strict diet, and spend hours practicing every day. From the outside, it might look like they're missing out on life. But really, they're preparing for something bigger. In the same way, God sometimes separates us to prepare us for a bigger role in his plan. This separation might involve physical distance from people or familiar places. Or it might be more of an emotional or spiritual separation, where God asks us to let go of old habits or ways of thinking. Let's look at how this might play out in everyday life. Imagine a man named John who's always been involved in his church, but mostly in the background. He helps out here and there, but he's never taken on any major responsibility. Then, God starts to separate John from his comfort zone. Maybe he feels a strong urge to step back from some of his usual activities. He might even feel a bit disconnected from his church friends for a while. During this time, John finds himself spending more time in prayer and studying the Bible. What John doesn't realize is that God is preparing him for a leadership role in the church. All that extra time in prayer, it's building his spiritual strength. Those hours studying the Bible, they're giving him the knowledge he'll need to teach others. When the time comes and John is asked to lead a new ministry in the church, he's ready. The season of separation has prepared him in ways he never expected. Remember Joseph, who we talked about earlier? His story is a perfect example of how God uses separation to prepare us for bigger things. Joseph didn't just jump from being his father's favorite son to being second in command in Egypt. There was a long period of preparation in between. First, Joseph was separated from his family and sold into slavery. In Potiphar's house, he learned how to manage a large household. Then, he was falsely accused and thrown into prison. There, he learned how to handle responsibility even in unfair and difficult circumstances. All of these experiences were preparing Joseph for his future role. When he finally stood before Pharaoh, he had the skills and character needed to save a nation from famine. You see, separation is often God's training ground. It's where he teaches us lessons we couldn't learn any other way. Maybe he's teaching you patience by making you wait for something. Or perhaps he's teaching you compassion by allowing you to go through a difficult experience. Whatever the lesson, remember that God is a good teacher. He doesn't separate us to punish us, but to prepare us. Every experience, every challenge, is an opportunity to grow and become more like the person God created you to be. So if you're feeling separated right now, ask yourself, what might God be preparing me for? What skills or character traits am I developing in this season? How might God use this experience in my future? It's not always easy to see the purpose in our separation while we're going through it. Joseph probably didn't understand why he was in prison. David might have wondered why he was hiding in caves instead of sitting on a throne. But looking back, we can see how God was working in their lives. In the same way, you might not understand your current season of separation, but trust that God is working. He sees the big picture, even when we can't. As it says in Romans 8 verse 28, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." So if you're in a season of separation, don't fight it. Embrace it. Use this time to grow closer to God, to learn the lessons he's teaching you, and to prepare for whatever he has next. Remember, in God's hands, your separation is not a setback. It's a setup for something greater. How to handle separation. When God separates us, it can be a challenging and often painful experience. But how we handle this separation can make all the difference in our spiritual growth and in fulfilling God's purpose for our lives. So, let's talk about some practical ways to navigate these times of divine separation. First and foremost, try to embrace the solitude. I know, it's not easy. We're social creatures, and being separated from others can feel unnatural and uncomfortable. But remember, even Jesus often withdrew to lonely places to pray. He understood the value of solitude and connecting with God. So, instead of fighting against the feeling of being alone, lean into it. Use this time to develop a deeper, more intimate relationship with God. Start a prayer journal where you can pour out your heart to God and record how he speaks to you. You might be surprised at how much clearer God's voice becomes when the noise of the world is turned down. During times of separation, it's crucial to stay rooted in God's Word. The Bible is our anchor, keeping us steady when everything else seems to be shifting. Make a commitment to read your Bible every day, even if it's just a few verses. Let God's promises wash over you and remind you of his faithfulness. Try memorizing scriptures that speak to your situation. Verses like Jeremiah 29 verse 11, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." Or Isaiah 41 verse 10, "So do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." These words can be a source of comfort and strength when you're feeling lonely or discouraged. It's easy to fall into negative thinking when we're separated from others. We might start to feel sorry for ourselves or wonder if God has forgotten us. But maintaining a positive attitude is crucial during these times. Remember, your attitude can either lift you up or bring you down. Choose to see your separation as an opportunity rather than a punishment. Look for the silver linings. Maybe you now have more time to pursue a hobby you've been neglecting. Or perhaps this separation is giving you a chance to rest and recharge. Gratitude can be a powerful tool in maintaining a positive attitude. Each day, try to list 3 things you're thankful for. Even in the midst of separation, there's always something to be grateful for. While God may be calling you to a season of separation, this doesn't mean you have to cut yourself off from everyone completely. Stay connected with your church community, even if it's just through online services or small group video calls. Reach out to trusted friends or mentors who can provide spiritual support and encouragement. The key is to make sure these connections are healthy and aligned with what God is doing in your life. If certain relationships or activities are distracting you from what God is trying to teach you, it might be necessary to step back from them for a time. Even in times of separation, we can still find ways to serve others. In fact, serving can be a powerful antidote to the loneliness and self-focus that often come with separation. Look for ways to help people, even from a distance. This could be as simple as sending encouraging messages to friends, volunteering for a phone support line, or using your skills to help with online ministry efforts. Remember, Joseph served faithfully whether he was in Potiphar's house or in prison. Your circumstances don't determine your ability to make a difference in someone's life. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, trust God's timing. Separation is usually a temporary season, even if it feels like it's lasting forever. God knows exactly how long this period needs to last to accomplish his purposes in your life. As it says in Ecclesiastes 3 verse 1, "There is a time for everything, and a season for every activity under the heavens." Trust that God knows what season you need to be in right now, and that he'll bring you into a new season when the time is right. Now, let's zoom out a bit and look at the bigger picture of why God separates us. It's easy to get caught up in our own experiences and forget that God is working on a much larger scale than we can see. You see, when God separates us, it's never random or pointless. It's always part of His master plan, not just for our lives, but for the world around us. Think about Joseph again. His separation from his family wasn't just about his personal growth or even about saving his family from famine. It was about positioning him to save many nations and to move forward God's plan for the Israelites. Or consider Moses. His time of separation in the wilderness wasn't just about personal transformation. It was about preparing him to lead an entire nation out of slavery and into freedom. In the same way, your separation might be about more than just you. God might be positioning you to make a difference in your family, your community, or even on a larger scale that you can't yet imagine. It's helpful to think of separation as a time of preparation, just like an athlete trains before a big game, or a student studies before an important exam. God uses times of separation to prepare us for what's ahead. This preparation might involve developing new skills, deepening your faith, healing from past hurts, or breaking old habits. Whatever it is, trust that God knows exactly what you need to be ready for the next phase of your life. Another way to look at separation is as a refining process. In Malachi 3 verse 3, it says, "He will sit as a refiner and purifier of silver." A silversmith has to keep the silver in the fire until all the impurities are burned away. But here's the beautiful part. The silversmith knows the silver is pure when he can see his own reflection in it. In the same way, God keeps us in the fire of separation until He can see His reflection in us more clearly. It's not about punishment. It's about purification. It's about becoming more like Christ. Your journey through separation can also serve as a powerful testimony to others. When people see you maintaining your faith and joy even in times of loneliness or hardship, it can be a strong witness to God's faithfulness. Remember, others are watching how you handle this season. Your perseverance and trust in God during separation can inspire and encourage those around you, even if you don't realize it at the time. Let me share a personal story that illustrates how God can use separation for a greater purpose. There was a woman named Sarah who had always been deeply involved in her church. She led worship, taught Sunday school, and was always the first to volunteer for any event or ministry opportunity. But then, quite suddenly, Sarah felt God calling her to step back from all her church activities. At first, she resisted. How could God be asking her to separate from the very place where she felt she was serving Him best? But the feeling persisted, and eventually, Sarah obeyed, though she didn't understand why. For months, Sarah felt lost. She missed her usual routines and the sense of purpose she got from her church involvement. She spent a lot of time alone, reading her Bible and praying, trying to understand what God was doing. During this time, Sarah started to notice things she had been too busy to see before. She realized that much of her identity had been wrapped up in her church activities, rather than in her relationship with God Himself. She also began to see areas of her life where she had been relying on her own strength rather than on God's. As she worked through these realizations, Sarah felt God nudging her in a new direction. She felt called to start a ministry for women who were struggling with infertility, something she had personal experience with but had never felt equipped to address. When Sarah finally returned to active ministry, she was a changed woman. Her faith was deeper, her dependence on God was stronger, and she had a new purpose that she might never have discovered if God hadn't called her into a season of separation. The ministry she started touched lives in ways her previous service never had. Women who had felt alone in their struggles found hope and community, and Sarah found a fulfillment she had never known before. Looking back, Sarah could see clearly how God had used that painful time of separation to prepare her for a ministry she never could have imagined. What had felt like a setback was actually God's setup for something beautiful. As we wrap up our exploration of why God separates us from others, let's recap some key points to remember. God's separation is always purposeful. It's never random or merely punitive. Whether it's to strengthen our faith, prepare us for a new role, or refine our character, God always has a good reason for separating us. Separation is often a time of preparation. Just as Jesus spent 40 days in the wilderness before starting his ministry, our times of separation can be preparing us for what God has next. How we handle separation matters. By staying close to God, maintaining a positive attitude, and looking for ways to serve others, we can make the most of these challenging times. God's timing is perfect. Even when we don't understand why we're going through a season of separation, we can trust that God knows exactly how long it needs to last. Our separation story can be a powerful testimony. How we navigate these times can inspire and encourage others in their own faith journeys. Remember, if you're going through a time of separation right now, you're in good company. Abraham, Joseph, Moses, David, and even Jesus all experienced times of divine separation. And in each case, that separation was a crucial part of God's bigger plan. So take heart. Your separation is not a punishment or a sign that God has forgotten you. On the contrary, it might just be evidence that God is getting ready to do something amazing in and through your life. Trust the process. Lean into God's presence. And keep your eyes open for how God might be working, even when you feel most alone. Because often, it's in these times of separation that God does his most transformative work in our lives. Your season of separation won't last forever, but the growth, the faith, and the closeness with God that you develop during this time, that can last a lifetime. And who knows? The person you become through this separation might be exactly who God needs you to be for the next chapter of your story. So embrace this time, use it well, and trust that on the other side of this separation, God has something wonderful waiting for you.